second speaker this morning is Dr. Rodney Teague. Rodney, welcome. Rodney came to psychology, like many people here, through literature, through Faulkner, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare. Whenever you hear those three together, you also hear resonances of Louise Cowan. So Rodney studied at the University of Dallas and also at the Dallas Institute, has his degree in humanities in a combination program, and but a degree in psychology, right, from out there, the university. And then you went on to another university, very unusual, Duquesne University, which is where I had my first teaching position. And they still say, keep him away. I did come back. So you bring an incredibly unique background to your present work, which is working at the Veterans Hospital here in Dallas, working with people who are really suffering, who suffer from post-traumatic stress and other like addictions, and so you work with this picture of the suffering and the resilience of the soul, and you're going to speak of that work with us in terms of Ananke and Athena. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Gail. Thank you, Larry. It's great to see you all, to be here. Early in Hillman's essay called Athena, Ananke, and Abnormal Psychology, that's chapter 2 in the Mythic Figures volume, he refers to earlier essays, one from the Myth of Analysis and the other from Revisioning Psychology, in which he argues for pathologizing as the fundamental activity of psyche understood as non-rational and independent of an heroic ego. Personifying necessity as the imageless and alterless goddess Ananke in this chapter, Hillman has distilled an essence of pathologizing. He has identified and described the necessity that is characteristic of and fundamental to psychopathology in the person of the goddess. He writes that the abnormal, scared, and crazy movement of the soul is not only necessary, it is necessity itself. I'll argue that the compulsive ingestions and pathological repetitions, which we call addiction, demonstrates the mode of operation of this goddess. The argument in two parts. The first, Ananke, Hillman's personified necessity, seems to rule the compulsions that we call addiction. A brief review of Hillman's character sketch of this goddess will support this point. However, this appearance occludes the influence of Athena, to whose temple the vast complex of images around addiction and recovery, as well as criminality and normalcy, belong. Thus, secondly, addiction is the result of Athena-influenced or brokered compromise with necessity, in which necessity is afforded a place in the city, an altar, so to speak. And what we sacrifice to Ananke over and over is addict. All of this compromise comes with the promise of a sustainable identity category called normal that can be enjoyed by a majority of the citizens, albeit a shrinking majority, as the proportion of people suffering with addictive disorders and other mental illnesses continues to rise. The fact of this shrinking majority demonstrates the limitations of the existing bargain with necessity. However, because of our Athena-inspired focus on the good of the collective, we are blind to addiction as a compromise, believing instead that it is an objectively real category of abnormality. It is possible and desirable to renegotiate the relationship with Ananke, but this requires that we step back, and adopt an open-eyed and ironic perspective on the limitations with which Ananke confronts us. Finally, I will assert, but not really argue in this presentation, that addiction, in this way of considering it, is an exemplar or even a prototype for all mental illness, abnormal psychology, and abnormalcy more broadly. So Ananke is linked to the pathological, deformed, and irrational, to overpowering underworld force, or Bia, as in the kidnapping and rape of Persephone by and into Hades. She is looming when one is tossed or blown by elemental forces and has lost rational control. She is the narrowing constriction of a dangerous, overgrown ravine pass and of strangulation. The noose, slave collar, yoke, perhaps necktie, handcuffs, and zip ties, all that binds, suffocates, silences, circumscribes, and ensnares, all belong to her. These images also belong to addiction. The previously rational, independent person finds her time and energy increasingly devoted to habitual and then compulsive activity. Anxiety mushrooms along with internal conflicts among aspirations, desires, obligations, and cravings for the substance or activity that brings relief. Guilt and shame lead to isolation and secrecy. No longer self-reliant or self-reliable, the addict depends now for subjective well-being, body, mind, and soul, on the relieving compulsion or chemical. Anxiety and conflict eventually resolve as desires, interests, and commitments all fall away. One's world and choices narrow to a singular path, stuck in a rut, a stasis of repetition, buffeted, out of control, without direction or horizon, going nowhere but the graveyard or the prison. So Ananke, as compulsion and compelled, drives this so-called cycle of addiction. We hear the repetition in the metaphor, and it is in the ascendant neurobiology of addiction as well. Addiction is called a progressive brain disease that hijacks the so-called reward circuitry, the mesolimbic system of the brain. A biochemical broken record, an errant feedback loop, caught in the encircling trap. And certainly there's a lot we could say about absurd circularity in the public health crisis of prescription opioid addiction, pain, prescription, dependence, regulation, overdose, on and on. Tolerance and withdrawal are the primary physical indicators of addiction, and these highlight the body's enslavement to necessity. Failure to manage and maintain one's social, familial, or occupational obligations is a psychological indicator, and this one highlights another dimension of Ananke's rule. Hillman writes that the family relationships and the ties we have in our personal worlds are ways we experience the force of necessity. Servitude to these ties is a way of observing necessity's demands, of serving at her altar. On the other hand, he writes, our attempts to be free of personal binds are attempts at escaping from the tight circle of Ananke. Here, the addiction cycle illustrates the dizzying and implacable power of Ananke's necessity. Seeking relief from his duties to family, career, societal expectations, and his own aspirations, the addict is driven as by the lash into yet another entanglement. There is no escape from obligation, only forced choice among obligations. Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a Gothic tale of diabolical resolution to the problem of man's dual nature, gets an occasional reference in popular and professional treatments of addiction. The allegorical reading has it that the evil Edward Hyde is an addictive personality entertained by the good Dr. Jekyll, and which eventually takes over and blots out its host. Here again, the story ends in death. Dr. Jekyll's written account of his experimental and, we might say, alchemical transformation, that is his lengthy suicide note, comprises the final chapter of the short novel. We read there that once under the effect of his potion, he experienced a solution to the bonds of obligation and an unknown freedom of the soul. His was freedom from personal and professional obligations, presumably, but also certainly from the strictures of societal and class obligations, as well as from any humanizing moral structure. Only a few lines later, he reports that he was in the very moment of his freedom sold into slavery. No escape from servitude to Ananke, out of the frying pan and into the fire. The matter of personal versus public obligations opens the next point of complexity regarding addiction and Hillman's personified necessity. An unusual goddess, she is unimaged and without alter, participating instead in all other archetypes as the necessity and pathology inherent to them. Necessity is experienced, Hillman writes, when one is compelled and there is no image of what is occurring. He suggests an inverse proportion between images and drivenness. The more the image and the alter, the less the blind necessity. The more the compulsion, the less we are able to sacrifice, to connect our personal compulsion with something divine. And in the subsequent passage, he suggests that the Jungian analytical task includes shifting pressure away from the literal, and he says red, compulsion through imagination toward the blue image. When she is invisible and unacknowledged, that is, Ananke exerts maximal compulsion. But Hillman does suggest that we may imaginally establish and serve necessity's alter. In lines noted previously, we work out our obligation to Ananke by attending to kinship and personal ties. Thus, one result of Hillman's move to personifying Ananke is that in acknowledging and naming her, we also explicitly acknowledge the limits of our freedom. We sacrifice a fantasy of total freedom in the choices we make to honor our commitments, and in so doing, we reduce our vulnerability to literalized and embodied compulsions. In an essay titled Eating as Natural Event and as Intersubjective Phenomenon, phenomenologist Bernd Jager argues that disordered consumption, and he takes anorexia and alcoholism for his examples, that disordered consumption result from a failure to fully participate in a human world or cosmos that must be differentiated from the natural animal state. A habitable human world requires the establishment of civilizing thresholds that hold in dynamic tension the distances among neighbors and among divine and human participants. By simultaneously dividing and uniting, thresholds create places for encountering one another and thus for habitation and hospitality. They introduce the possibility of sacrifice by inserting distance and time between desire and action. The drink and the meal must be offered and received rather than simply consumed. For Jager, alcoholic thirst is beyond chemical quenching, beyond the reach of hospitably offered wine, or indeed any goblet, cup, or beaker. Rather, the addict seeks that which oozes from a primordial source prior to any prohibition. He yearns for a world untouched by threshold, limit, or law. Civilizing thresholds are not established once and for all time. They must rather be renegotiated and continually reestablished. Thus, we are subject to temptations of fantastic, innocent union and limitlessness that lead to what Jager calls regressive and unweaned forms of eating and drinking, in which the cultural labor of production, of installing thresholds, and thus of dwelling is undone. Jager's conception of the threshold corresponds to Hillman's image and altar. Both establish sacred, sacrificial space where brutal instinct may be sublimated to cosmological and psychological habitation, but these require attention and commitment. At the personal level, one acknowledges and sacrifices fantasies of fusion and omnipotence for the sake of participating in a human world. But note that the threshold is culturally mediated. Hillman's formulation in the Ananke chapter shows her operations as coinciding with those of Athena as the protector of the polis and the people. This prompts me to question how the thresholds are collectively established. Jager's alcoholic becomes lost to social order when she abandons the rules that govern hospitable behavior, but I contend that she becomes an addict when she is herself sacrificed at Ananke's altar for the sake of that human social order. With respect to addiction and at the collective level, what we have chosen to sacrifice at necessity's altar is persons turned imaginally to addicts, or mythologized as addicts, or crackheads, or mothers of crack babies, winos and wastrels, etc. One of Hillman's great insights in the advancement of archetypal psychology, one we've discussed in past meetings and here today and last night, is that archetypes are not static portraits of gods and goddesses or catalogs of traits. The gods never appear alone. Rather, archetypes present dynamic patterns of interactions among mythological persons. The Ananke Athena archetype is one such dynamism, and Hillman draws its template from Aeschylus' Humanities. We've talked about last night. Gail gave us a great synopsis about that. Oresteia, Athena's work of inviting the Erinyes to be part of the city, and so diffusing the conflict. There, Athena and Ananke are linked because of Athena's power of rhetorical persuasion. It is the only power that overcomes, that contends with, placates, incorporates the force of necessity in the persons of the Erinyes. Referring to Athena, Hillman writes, in her is combined the very contradictions that she must reconcile, the reason of her father and the binding force of Ananke with those with whose collaboration her father rules. Only with her offer of compromise, that is, to incorporate the forces of necessity as resident aliens, is reconciliation achieved. Immediately following this passage in the chapter 2, Hillman gives a beautiful description of the power of rhetorical word magic to transform reality by allowing the darkest elements to take part and have place, to speak and let them speak. And he rightly insists on the paramount importance of this power to psychotherapy. But with respect to his formulation about the Humanities, I have the suspicion that all of this proceeds through problematic subterfuge. Your problem isn't a problem, says Athena. Let them come and stay among us. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Let the parade begin. So, the certain destruction of Orestes and perhaps the city that's threatened by a seemingly irreconcilable rift is averted by rhetorically inviting both sides to live together. Relations have been normalized by Athena between these camps. But the shadowy rest of the story involves Athena's normative pathologizing, or what and what or whom gets sacrificed as part of the bargain she has brokered. Hillman concludes this chapter with a discussion of Athena's pathologizing and fantastic strategic normalizing as the operating principle and the blind spot of her power of persuasion. Her provident foresight in protective service of the greater good of the city weaves together disparate elements into one whole without any ragged edges. There can be no remainder. Integration, says Hillman, is her ideal norm. But he also says that normalization implies judgment. Quantitative and qualitative notions of normality merge in our minds, he writes, when we say mean, middle, average, or extreme, exceptional, deviate. We are denoting statistical frequencies, but also connoting qualitative valuations deeply embedded in language. And then a few lines down, abnormal is both a statistical definition and a moral condemnation. What is odd becomes wrong. What is unusual and irregular becomes reprehensible. Athena's pathologizing proceeds necessarily through normative inclusions and exclusions. Hillman characterizes this as a kind of institutional mothering, justified through appeal to objective external standards of moral acceptability. He writes, to feel that norms and objectives are independent of structures of consciousness and the archetypal persons governing them, reveal that we are standing in Athena's temple. The interweaving of normative and objective thinking is precisely the blind spot in Athenian consciousness. Here, it cannot see through itself and into the archetypal fantasy it is enacting. The paper goes into a little bit of depth about the Jekyll and Hyde story. Part of what's chilling about the Jekyll and Hyde story isn't the fiend Edward Hyde or the murders, but the context, the lawyer Utterson, who brings us the story and who is so concerned with the middle, with the normal, with moral rectitude, a moderate path, professional reputation, decorum, and those things seem more important than the murderous actions of Mr. Hyde. Returning to the case of addiction, it seems that while chemical and behavioral compulsions belong to Ananke, Athena consciousness is the author and ruler of addiction. Her normalizing reconciliation has integrated irrational and pathological consumption by the establishment of permanent moral, medical, and political categories of abnormality under the umbrella of addiction. Jager connects the term addiction etymologically, going back to Roman times, with the literal enslavement of a person who cannot fulfill his debts and obligations. It meant then the forfeiture of an individual's civil and subjective agency. We have, I believe, for the sake of the common good, enshrined structures that recapitulate and enforce that forfeiture socially and psychologically, but also bodily and literally through the medicalization and especially the criminalization of addiction. The necessity of Athena consciousness protective logic is virtually unassailable. Addiction is bad for individuals because it subverts common standards of decency and the ideals of the best society. Irrational choices and addictive substances cause addiction. Therefore, we must excise irrationality and institute abstinence and prohibition. Addicts forfeit subjective agency and are assigned to a separate class of less than persons. Some are incarcerated and subsequently banished from the legal economy. Some are initiated into the cult of addiction and recovery, where they will become adherents and servants of the temple, holders and guardians of all that is abnormal. In all cases, addicts are relegated to a realm outside of moral acceptability and rectitude. The fantastic normalcy here described distorts and denies the necessity and ubiquity of pathologizing. We have chosen the tyranny of normalizing judgment over Athena's wise and hospitable persuasion, the xenia she inherits from Zeus. As a result, we fail to honor Ananke, necessity, attempting either to transform and obliterate her pathologizing necessity or else expelling her from the city, rather than making a place for her alien residency. We saw earlier that that's untenable. No alter and image means maximal compulsion. There is no escape from necessity, and that a failure to honor her by image and alter leads to the most wretched and blasted compulsion. Thank you.